Have it for Shalom, amen.
How's he right now?
I think he's still in the hospital.
He's pretty young, isn't he?
Yes, he is. Mendel, can you read his name out over there in the text that I sent you? We'll just dedicate the class today for his refuah shalema.
Yeah, 1 second.
Shmuel Eliezer ben Shoshana, maybe.
Shmuel Eliezer ben Shoshana something.
Shoshana Liba.
And Shoshana Liba should have a refuah shalema.
Amen.
All right, Chevre, with the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Shvius, Perek Zayin Halacha Aleph. We are learning Daf Nun Gimel. We are mamish on top of the Amid. So what we learned yesterday is that we were learning a source. The Gemara brought a source for the Mishnah's ruling that plants that could be used for dye stuff are imbued with the Kedusha of Shvi'is, with all of its consequences. Today we're going to start, and that was the lochem la'achla. The Gemara is going to start now by offering a potential other source, which will ultimately be rejected, and will come back to the only source of the lochem la'achla. Now, from there, after the Mishnah establishes that a plant that's used for dyeing is included in all of the rules of Shvi'is, the Gemara is going to inquire what happens to the plants that are primarily used for laundering garments. Is that purpose significant enough for that plant to be bestowed with the Kedusha of Shvi'is? The same question will be on Psamim, not to be confused with what we learned yesterday. Yesterday we learned about plants that are soaked in oil, and the oil is put on the person, what we call perfume. That clearly is included in all of the laws of Shvi'is. What we will question today is if you have a piece of wood, what we call Psamim, that you don't put on your body, but you use it to smell. People smell them. That's their primary purpose. Are they bestowed? Are they not bestowed? Same question will be regarding items that are used for creating oil for kindling. And again, I know we're going to quote this when we learned this inside. What we learned yesterday was that if you have foodstuff that is also commonly used for fuel, it may be used for fuel, it's imbued with the Kedusha of Shvi'is, because it's also Meichel Adam. What happens if something is not Meichel Adam? And we're going to speak about the rose. There are certain seeds somewhere in the rose that used to be squeezed, and they used to use it for oil. Will that be included or imbued with Kedusha Shvi'is or not? That's going to lead us b'chlal to a braisa. We're going to learn a lot about roses today that speak about three parts of the rose, three halachic parts of the rose, which is going to lead us into the topic of kavush kemevushal, which is a sugya that we have in Masechtas Chulin, the Negeya Iser Veheter. We will see how that could apply, and to some degree it does apply to the dinim here of Shvi'is, and ultimately we're going to have a story in the Gemara that will make clear that when a topic is being discussed in the Beis HaMedrash, even if a Tana or an Amoida gave a ruling, if they gave the ruling in the context of learning Torah, that does not mean that that ruling applies halacha l'maisa if there's an actual case. And these are two different oilamas. And only when someone responded to an actual question asked, there is where we can say that that Tana or that Amoida, they paskint halacha l'maisa. So Chevra Daf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph. Again, mamash on top, by the dot, Rabbi Yosi b'shem Rabbi Law. He says, again, we are looking for a source that an item that is used for dyeing, as the Mishnah says, is included in the rules and restrictions of Shvi'is. And the pasuk that he will quote, Rabbi Yosi, is the pasuk right after the pasuk that we quoted yesterday. So just to read out the psukim, if you have a Torah Oir Hashalom, so the pasuk of Lachem La'achla, this is all in the parsha of the week, Parshas Bahar. V'hoisa Shabbos ha'aretz Lachem La'achla. Again, the question was the word Lachem is superfluous and it's more inclusive. L'chol la'abdechol la'masecho l'schircho l'soshavcha ha'goram imach. And then the next pasuk continues V'levehemtecha V'lachaya asher ba'artzecha. And the Torah could have ended over here, because since Vayikra Chafei Vav, and this is Vayikra Chafei Zayin, the pasuk already began that the Hoysa Shabbos Haaretz Lochem La'achla. So even though this is the next pasuk, everything that's written is lochem la'achla. But nevertheless, the Torah continues, tihiyeh kol tfuasa lechol. The whole edition is extra. So says the Gemara, Shema min ado, when it says tihiyeh, again, many say that the limud is not only from the word tihiyeh, but it's tihiyeh kol tfuasa lechol. Why does the Torah add all of these words to tell you that it shall be not only to eat, even though the Torah says tihiyeh lochem, tihiyeh kol tfuasa lechol, since it's extra, it's adding something that is used beyond than only for eating. And what is that? Af lahadlakas haner. And if something is ulitzboya tseva, that what? That is included in the kedusha of shvis. Now, hold on. Now he has a kasha, which is that if you have food that's designated l'maychol adam, that's Michael Adam, v'lo nimsa ma'abed es oichlei Adam. Like, why would the pasuk be including you doing something that should not be done? Why it should not be done? Because something that's designated for human food should not be used for dying. And therefore, and achanami, we're not speaking about something that's used for human food. We're using for something that's designated for dying. Tiftar betzavuyim la'adam. Gavaldik. Because if not, it doesn't make sense. Not because of the dinim of shvis. Why would one be allowed to take a bona fide human food and use it for dying? It's a degradation of the usage of the food. So here it must be that we're speaking about something that its only purpose is for dying. Its only purpose is for dying. Nevertheless, it's included in V'hoisa Shabbos Ha'aretz. Shabbos means you have to rest with all of the dinim of Kedusha Shvis. So says Rav Mana to Rabbi Yosei, I disagree with your source. Why? I agree with your premise that if something is bona fide, oichlei adam, it should not be used litzeva. I get that. But something that's designated for oichle behema, and we already said that it says explicitly in the Torah that what is included in the dinim of Shvi'is aren't only foods that are designated l'maychel adam. It includes foods that are designated l'maychel behema, like we learned in the Mishnah, right? Thorns and thistles. If they're soft enough that animals eat it, they are included with all of the laws, the holiness, and the restrictions of Shvi'is. And that, something that's primarily used for maychel behema, is allowed to be used for dying, for human needs, tiftar ba'ichle behema, which is going to be used la'adam. And therefore, since that could be what the Torah is including in pasuk Zayin, v'lei shama min klum, you cannot derive over here that if you have an item that's not designated not l'maychel adam and not l'maychel behema, only used for dying. Maybe if that's its only purpose, from this pasuk, you don't know that it is chashav enough for it to be imbued with kedusha shvis, which is not a problem. I mean, according to Rav Mana, because we have the limud that we learned yesterday that the word lochem la'achla, the lochem is extra, and lochem is something more inclusive, and that taka teaches us that any item, even if its only purpose is for dying, that's included in the dinim, and it's imbued with the kedusha of Shvi'is. Okay, very good. So now let's continue with this topic, which is what were to happen if there's a plant that the only purpose for which people use the plant is to make dyes that is used libehemam, for the animal itself, or for their clothing, or for certain utensils for animals. It's something relatively insignificant. So the question is, the Gemara wants to know if something, a plant, is only used for tzuvoyim libehemam, it makes no difference whether, some, I don't know, I'm not in the animal world, but, some animals have to be painted. Well, that's the halach yelech, that's the way people do it. Certainly, if animals wear certain types of clothing, maybe people have to put on certain, warm shawls over animals in the freezing winter. And they don't want to spend expensive dyes for it, so they're using something secondary, etc. So the question is, Mao sheyehei aleim kedusha shvi'is. Maybe, in other words, maybe it's so insignificant that there's no Kedusha Shvius. And therefore, there's no rules. We're speaking about there's no rules of Shvius. We're not talking about planting them. That's something prohibited because I'm not allowed to work the land. I'm talking about harvesting them, doing business with them, taking them out of Eretz Yisrael. That midrabanan you cannot pay the Shvius. Even if that item doesn't last throughout the winter, even if it's not Meskayim, it won't be subject to beer. So says the Gemara, Nashmeinam and Adom. It says in the Braisa. Now we're going to open up about roses, and we'll get back to it. That Iker Havered, guys, just like we had the Iker of the luf, the root of a rose, the Iker Ho'ege. Now, I'm happy Kevin is here today. This took me time. Let me see if I can pronounce it correctly. And Ege, according to some, is Kali Katomi Vilosa. Now we know the word, but it's a yellow. When I looked yesterday, it's a yellow type of flower, I think. Anyways, I found another one. The root of it, Daf Nun Gimel, Amud Aleph, or the Iker Ha'oig. The guys we learned about Ha'oig, I forgot where, but maybe I think even in this Masechta, and we're speaking Dafka about red sumac. And again, these are items that were used to produce dyes for animal. So the Braisa says, "Befedish ein behem kedusha shvis." Indeed, in other words, we're on the right track. There has to be a place where even if something is used, because we figured out how to use everything, because God made it, it's for something. If the usage is going to be what halacha will consider insignificant, then it won't be included in all of the dinim of shvis. Okay, so now let's move on to another topic. Dye the animal, or dye their clothing, or dye their utensils. Not anything that's for animals. Now, next thing is mine kivisoids, plants that were used for laundering clothing. This is something that you would argue is more significant. It's tzevoim lebehema, because it's human clothing. But let me tell you, it's not to dye human clothing. Dyeing human clothing is something more permanent. So it's something more chashuv. We all know laundering, you launder it, you wear it, you make it dirty. It's something that doesn't last. It's less significant than dyeing. So ma'u sheyehei aleim kedusha shvis. No, it's kivisa, deemed significant enough of a use for you to say that this, since it's made for laundering, it's imbued with kedusha shvis or not. So the Gemara says, nishmeina min adoh. Another braisa. And the Braisa speaks about 3 items that were used then for laundering purposes. Hadah from this, and sometimes it's a Mishnah, sometimes it's a Braisa. But the rule is then that Amoraim who want to resolve something generally or ideally will quote the works of the Tanoim, even though, many times Amoraim quote the works of Rav or Rabbi Yechanan from this. It's very vague. And it happens to be a braisa that hayar onim. Now, what's hayar onim? So the Gira says, first of all, that the girsa is leunin, according to him, and leunin is wormwood, because that is something that we know from elsewhere used to be used for laundering purposes. Or haboiris. Boiris is a certain species of aloe. Or va'ohol is the regular aloe. So the Braisa again says, "Befedish yesh lem kedusha shvis." That's clear. Now, what about psamim? Before you go on, people say, "What do you mean? What about psamim?" What we learned about yesterday? That
so kedusha shvis just means you can't destroy it, you can't like ruin it or whatever.
All of the dinim that we started to introduce in this chapter, much more than you can ruin it. You can't do schayda with peidah shvis. That you can't midrabanan take it out of Eretz Yisrael. That if that item is not miskayim ba'aretz, so normally there would be the din of biur. If it's ein b'em kedusha shvius, it won't be subject to shvius. The only thing you may not do is you may not plant it, Danny, because planting it is not about the plant; it's about you working the land. Loisizro, that I may not do. But the prohibition of ksira, however, you're going to understand the limitations that we have on harvesting. If ein b'hem kedusha shvius, those limitations will not apply to them.
So if there's in kedusha shvius, can you actually plant it also? Like, can you plant sumac?
I just mentioned the only thing you can't do is
also
plant.
No, even if it has no kedusha shvius.
That's correct, because I can't work the land. But everything going forward, I can harvest it. I don't have to be mafkid it. Okay. Now, psamim. What we learned yesterday, that the items that were soaked in oil for the oil to be placed on a human being, that certainly is included, and it is imbued with kedusha shvis. It's something very chashuv. It's not chashuv. It's very chashuv. And like we said at Shavah L'chol Nefesh, it's roy la'ani. The ani can't afford it. It's roy for everyone, and the ani not only can he not afford it, and therefore he'll never have it. Maybe he'll have it today. He'll win the lottery. Psamim means items that are not put on the human being. It's like the cloves that someone, I don't know, invented. I'm really curious to know more about the cloves. Cloves is a smell in perfume that is a siman that the perfume was going bad. So cloves is a reach ra in the world of perfume. Mamish. Whoa. Cloves, what many people put in their psamim boxes. We're supposed to use hadassim. Many people use cinnamon and other inyanim that you find in Chazal. Okay, maybe it was something very cheap and something that lasts very long. Could be cloves, lasts forever, because even when it goes off, cloves, when something goes off, it smells like cloves. So anyways, psamim, what about psamim? Mao she'yeh aleim kedusha shvi is. So for that says the Gemara, nishma'ina min adam. And quoting a Braisa, haperach lavan, many people say it's white lily, even though literally it means white flower. And we're going to go with the Girsa oiren. Oiren is called Loris nobilis. Here we go. Ein aleim kedusha shvi'is gevaldik. Bidiyuk. Now, again, in contrast, the dun, the tzad, the zera, again, what we learned yesterday, that's something else. That yesh lahem kedusha shvi'is. But this was grown primarily for people to smell them. So the Braisa says that no, ein behem kedusha shvi'is, chavedaf nun gimel amid veis. However, here we have a machlekes. Finally, says the Gemara that chavraya amrin. No, that the Braisa that you quoted, true, it's a Braisa, but that Braisa only reflects the shita of Rab Shimon, the Rab Shimoni. The Rab Shimon Amar ein liktov shvi'is b'pnei she'enoi peri. Now, I just want to say ktov. We're familiar with ktov. We say this every day, or we should. That Rab Shimon Aliyah Omer. Hatsori einoi elo suraf hanoiteif ma'atzei haktov. Let's go that ketov is some sort of balsam, right? That people would smell, and Rab Shimon says that there's no kedusha shvis. Now, even though Rab Shimon is speaking about ketov, we're going be'ingen le'ingen that just like ketov, it's a sap from a tree, is not imbued with kedusha shvis. So therefore, the other plants that we mentioned, the white lily, is also not imbued with kedusha shvis. Only thing is that when you read the Braisa, and the Braisa says that Rab Shimon Amar, that's a sheet of Rab Shimon, that implies, or maybe it's explicit there, that the Chachamim disagree with that. And just like the Chachamim hold that Ktaf, even though it's not a pri, is imbued with kedusha shvis, the Chachamim will hold that the Chachamim might hold. See, it's not clear. And now, what do I mean by the Chachamim might hold? I'll tell you why. Because Ktaf, you have to know, Ktaf, aside of people using it for its fragrance, people would use Ktaf, believe it or not, to curdle cheese. And people would use Ktaf for the oil, for the perfume that we just mentioned from yesterday. Some people would actually put it on their bodies. That for sure is imbued with Kedusha Shviz. Now, most people did not use ketaf to put on their bodies. Most people would not use ketaf to curdle cheese. So bottom line is that you're quoting me a Braisa. I know that Braisa Shita Rab Shimon. That's for sure. I can argue that. The Chachamim who argue befedish by ketaf, and they say ketaf is imbued with kedusha shviz, I can argue lechachamim both ways to the inquiry. You understand? The Gemara is not saying that lechachamim vadai, the white lily has kedusha shviz. We're not saying that. We're saying we have a doubt because the proof that you brought can all that Braisa can follow Rab Shimon. And lechachamim, I'm back to the question. Shmuel berababo Tifter says even more than that. I'll tell you even more why this cannot be a proof. That maybe divrei hakolu, that bahado nisurta, even Rab Shimon who holds that that ketaf that ketaf is not a pri and it's not imbued. However, when it comes to the white lily, when it comes to the what was the other product, when it comes to the that fancy word, Dav Gedenken Balpe over here, the Loris nobilis, when it comes over there, they have a wood in it. It's a wooden stem. And there is a fragrance coming out of the wood.
Well, the wood is used for what? For smell?
The wood, yeah. People would smell the wood. Or I can say in the other direction, that perhaps, Danny, the wood
says here the notes that
the wood smell is probably weaker than the smell of the balsam oil. That's the word. The wood is weaker than the balsam. Another reason why even the Chachamim, we're trying to point out that even the Chachamim that hold that Ktaf, Yesh Lem, Ktaf, L'Chachamim, Yesh Kedusha Shviz, that's because Ktaf is very powerful, very potent. But when you have a sliver of wood, it's probably much weaker. I know this. Wood is Shvach. So bottom line is that this remains unresolved. So we resolved the Tzeva Lebehema. Clear. We resolved items that are done for laundering, for human clothing. When it comes to psamim, we have an unanswered question, and now we're going to have another final, and that is minei adlikus ma islach. The way they spoke, it's when you have a product that is used only for creating oil for kindling lights. I'm emphasizing that because of something is designated l'maychel behema. That's the beginning of today's share, and you decide to use it for kindling. If that's the common secondary use, aleph, you are allowed to do it, and beis, of course, it's imbued with kedusha shviz because it's also meichel behema. We're going to be finding items in nature, parts of plants, that the only reason why people would harvest them, the usage then in the times of Chazal was only for creating oil for kindling. Maybe that's insignificant, even though people have hana'ah from it. So the question is, Mao, and what will be the examples of that? So either hahon pakua, it's called a desert gourd. The seeds, just to say, the seeds of the gourd were pressed into oil, or the hahon vered, the seeds. Now there's different parts of the rose. There's something in English that's called the rose hips. The rose hips is located immediately under the flower petals. And in those rose hips, there would be seeds, and the seeds would be taken and pressed, made into oil, and you would have kindling oil. I know that the Persians use roses by weddings and by funerals. They love it. They make agzei shava between them. Gate. It's amazing, right? Same rose, same smell. But here in Chazal, they used this Yerushalmi.
It's an Islamic custom the Iranians picked up.
Yeah. Okay. So the Gemara says, let's attempt to resolve it from the following Braisa. Tani bat klas milim, just quoting a Braisa, we learned 3 halachas regarding the rose. It's fascinating. In other words, that halachically we divide the rose into 3 parts, and each part has another halach. All in shaloi, the petals, its leaves. Look at this. Yesh lahem shviz, and therefore villa demeim shviz. And let me go further. That petals, they wither in winter. You kidding? You spend a lot of money, not downtown, you get a good price. But when you buy a Hila Covered Shabbos in the local, you spend a fortune, and it lasts a bissel, and it withers. They don't last, and therefore yesh lahem biur ulad meim biur. Okay, so that's clear. Now, why is it so clear, my friends, that the olin of a rose is imbued with kedusha shviz? Because people would use rose petals to season food, believe it or not. I'm not a chef, but Danny is a maven in food. The Gabbai, the Chazal say that you season food with rose petals, and it makes it chashuv for that, then it gets shviz. It's fascinating. Listen to what we're saying. We're saying that you can't do business with roses on shviz. This is really practical stuff. It could be if that's the whole. That's exactly what we're learning.
It's
That not
probably
saying
with the
flowers.
rose water. Probably
Huh?
rose water. They use rose water, so they probably make
use
the rose water out of the
and the
petals.
petals are very good. But what's amazing, so no, but Dan, that's exactly Dan. Hello, no, that's what we're saying. That if something is there only for aesthetics, then it's not imbued with kedusha shvius. That's what we're learning. There has to be. See, if it's used for food, that's or if the type of perfume that you put on your body, and if you don't put it on your body only to smell, question mark. That's mamash what we're learning. Beautiful. In other words, like, guys, this is halacha l'maisa. We're think about an Eretz Yisrael, the whole business of flowers l'kavat Shabbos. Okay, right. Pika shaloi. Now, pika is exactly what we're talking about. Pika is that what in the English it's called the rose hips. Okay, and here the Braisa says, Chavira, listen to this. Yesh lo shvis ulo demel shvis. Ooh, so here clear have the answer. In other words, even though then it does. See, you have to understand that the ideas are eternal. Its application could vary because maybe today people use it for other purposes. But I'm saying in the times of Chazal, the pika, which is the rose hips or the kilix, was exclusively used to produce oil. Yeah, the little's very good. And 1 second. The only thing is that it's not subject to biur, and therefore not lit up meir, according to the Chachamim. Remember the Mishnah. V'loy l'demel biur, because it doesn't wither in winter, because the seeds last, they don't go off. It's always been nimsa. Point is that clearly you see that something that's exclusively used to produce a kindling, for kindling, it's oil not to eat. They didn't eat it. It wasn't good to eat. Is imbued with kedusha shviz. Now, iker shaloi, the root of the rose, ein loy shviz, v'loy l'dam of shviz, and ein loy biur, v'loy l'dam of biur. How great is that? And I want you to know something, that the only thing that the root was used for, it was used to produce dye for animals. And that's exactly how we began today's daf. 1 second, that if something is exclusively used to do dye only for animals, not dye for human beings, that's not chashuv enough to imbue it with kedusha shviz. So now we have a braisa that really covers a lot of what we learned today. This is great. So now the Gemara is coming with the kasha. Now that we mentioned the rose, Rabbi Yirmiyah asked in front of Rabbi Bo, Ma'u lichboish min hahon vered, are you allowed to soak the rose? And why would you soak the rose? You are soaking the rose because you want to produce oil to have the scent in the oil of a rose. Rose oil, are you allowed to do it or not? Now, what's the kasha? Look inside the rose that you talk about, a rose. Wow. Yes. Ma'u lichboish, guys, and look in the marah full, the middle of the amid. Right? Divrei HaMaschal, Ma'u lichboish. What's the question? Frekte explains the manafulda. Imuter lasois mimenu kavush. Can you soak it for 24 hours? The kaimelon. We're going now, jumping to Masechtas Chulin. That kavush kemevushal. And I want you to know there's a machlokes Rashi in the Rosh. Very important. When do we say kavush kemevushal? I forgot which Rishon says what, but one of them say even if it's tam cold water, without any type of chimutz, without any type of sharpness or vinegar added in the water.
Why did you say 24 hours?
I'm saying 24 hours because that's the halacha. Kavush kemavushal, I know, but that's why you're here in the class. Kavush kemavushal is 24 hours. I want to say like this, that kavush kemavushal, guys, listen to this. Every area in Torah doesn't follow the same track. When it comes to Shabbos, as an example, Bishul is one of the Lamates Malachas. Shabbos is more than 24 hours. Shabbos is more than 24 hours. One is allowed to do kavush on Shabbos. And we're not going to say kavush kemavushal because bishul on Shabbos is eish and toldos eish. That's it. We're speaking about Isser v'heter, and not to confuse. By Isser v'heter, that the tam is going to be nivla in the keli. Again, I know there's a machlokes rishonim. I wish I would remember who it's a machlokes Rashi and Rosh, and in Shulchan Aruch we paskin l'chumra that even if there's nothing other than cold water, that if I put a davar ha'asa with moisture, something that's prohibited to be consumed, even though it's cold, even though it's yavesh, but now I'm putting it in water, and it's sitting for 24 hours or more in a keli, the tam of the davar ha'asar is going to be permeated inside the walls of the keli. And you're going to have to get rid of kabbalah kachpalta. You can do another kavush to get rid of it. But what happens when you do kavush, so listen to this, that bishul is something that may not be done on a food item that could be eaten raw. That's a new din that we're learning today for Shvius. I am not allowed to destroy Peda Shvius because we learn la'achla v'loy l'schayra. I know that's what we are focusing on a lot in our sugya, but la'achla v'loy la'hefseid. How do you define hefseid? So you would argue that if I'm taking something, even if it could be eaten raw, if I'm cooking it to eat it cooked, you would think it's permitted. So that's the new thing that we didn't learn yet. We don't say that. Because of the kedusha of Shvius.
So no pickles.
Oh, very good, Danny.
No pickles on Shemitah.
Yeah, you can have old ones. Paket pickles last a long time. Davar shu nechal chai. Danny, 1 second. I want to go back to the pickles. The Gemara is not saying pickles. Danny, you're saying pickles. We're saying that you're not allowed to cook it. Can't cook something that can be eaten kshu chai on Shvius.
So you can't put carrots in your chicken soup.
That's gavaldik. I was mamish thinking about carrots, and I understand the logic of that. Because when you cook something, at least to my layman's knowledge, its longevity is severely diminished. When you cook, when you don't cook carrots, if you have raw carrots, I think they can last a really long time. Maybe only in my fridge, but they last a long. When you cook it, you ruin its longevity. You're mafsid it. So since there is a rule, listen to this, that you're not allowed to cook a item that is imbued with kedusha shvius, even if you're cooking it to eat it, if it could be eaten when it's raw. Look at the gavaldik kashem. Now we're not talking about cooking. Now we're talking about kavush, but based on the rule of kavush kemavushal. So for Hilchas Shabbos, we don't say that. For Hilchas Yisrael Heter, we do say it. Am I allowed? Now the question is, am I allowed to soak the rose in oil when that will be somehow ruining, right? Let me say it. You're rendering the petals inedible. We just said that roses were used to season food. There's a purpose in that. Roses also could be used to get oil for perfume. Based on the rule of kavush kemavushal, look how many things you have to know. So now the question is, am I allowed on Shvius to take rose petals that otherwise would have been used in food seasoning? And by the way, food seasoning clearly without cooking it. That's a good one, guys. Many you eat a salad today, they put fruits. I'm having a salad, they put fruits. There's a tangerine. Put some rose petals, see what happens. And then the Gabi will write an article about how great or not great it is. So what do you do? Amaloi, so the Mavot answered, no, he says that the primary purpose of rose petals is to create oil. In other words, the fact that some people would somehow use rose petals for seasoning, that's a minority. Since the main reason for which people then would use rose petals is to create the oil, to create perfume, of course that's allowed. Don't compare that. In other words, we're not debating the premise. No one is saying that we don't say kavush kemavushal for shvius. No one is saying that. Maybe we do say. What we are saying is that when are you not allowed to cook? Let's go to the cooking something, let's say a carrot. You're not allowed to cook a carrot because a carrot could be eaten raw. A carrot could be eaten as simis. Machnish can simis on shvius. And I Rosh Hashanah, okay. You'll have another segula. Don't make simis. But when it comes to rose petals, since the primary purpose is to make perfume out of it, to make oil, and as we just learned, and therefore, this kedusha shvius, but you're using it for what it was made for. Tani Rab Chia, no, I disagree with you. Rab Chia holds that rose petals is oichle yadamu. In other words, it's amazing. I would argue it's one of those halachas. The halacha is like all halachas; they are eternal. They're God's law. Its application will vary. Its application will vary because it's like tolei b'minhag hamakim. That Rab Chia held that rose petals is considered something that you put into food, and therefore, this is important. That even though perfume in itself is chashuv enough to imbue its plant with kedusha shvius, if something has a dual purpose, if the human part, if the human eating part is equal with the other part, Torah considers the eating part, it's dominant, the more important. And because of the kedusha that this has, you have to use it for that which is more chashuv and not for that which is less chashuv.
It's great for apes, for that, so it is.
Okay. The question is, what is it made for? To eat?
Rabbi, rose petals are used in jam.
I know, Kevin, you're a Persian, hustle.
It
You're
is.
trying to normalize your manhagim. Yeah, of course.
Of course.
Did you ever have? I never had rose petal jam. That doesn't mean anything, but I want to know if the gabbai. Danny, did you ever have rose petal jam?
Maybe at a Persian wedding.
Oh, there you go.
You didn't even know it.
And you didn't even know it. Okay, Gamal.
They make something called malabi, which is a dessert. Sometimes you get in the Israeli restaurants.
Exactly.
And that's made with
Rose petals.
With rose water flavor. So
and that's made in Israeli. That's Tanit Abchia.
Which comes from the rose petals. So
that's Tanit Abchia.
Everything in Persian has rose water in it.
There you go.
Kidding?
Okay. So
one second, can I ask you a question? According to what we're learning right now,
yes.
Can I go buy roses for my house for Shabbos? If you're not using it for food, if you're of the opinion that it's a species of rose that is used, like the petals or
can I ask you? I think I would add to your question. I have another question. One of the differences between something that's imbued with kedusha shvius or not is that if something has kedusha shvius, you can't throw it out. You have to wait for it to fully wither and then throw it out. So let's word it that way. Because when it comes to not doing schayre with Pei Shvis, Dani, you have two questions. We touched upon that yesterday, and we're not learning halacha l'maisa, but there is a big debate in the Rishonim, how broad or how narrow is the rule of not doing schayre with Pei Shvis. There's definitely ways, according to all of the Rishonim, for someone to sell flowers for Shabbos, roses for Shabbos. Okay, now, if the flower has no other use other than eitzim of smelling. In the Yerushalmi, it's unresolved. It's unresolved. The Yerushalmi didn't say that it doesn't have kedusha. We don't know. We don't know what Chachamim will hold. Maybe L'Rab Shimon. Maybe even L'Rab Shimon. Whatever. Okay, we'll leave it like that. Like Rab Shimon, L'Rab Shimon, L'Rashbi, there's no kedusha shvi. So let's call the Chachamim. I want to know if I have roses on Shvi'is. I'm asking the same question you're asking Danny in a different way. Am I allowed to throw them out after Shabbos, which is what many people do? Or do I have to wait until they are halachically so withered away that now I can throw them out? Like by the esrig, you can't just I am not eating it, it doesn't matter. It's still food stuff. That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, that's the topic over here. It sounds like roses have kedusha shvi'is. And then now the Gemara is going to give you gansa ma'asim with roses. There are different types of roses, different varieties. You have to know what variety. You have to know, again, this is when in the time of the Braisa, what roses ABC were cultivated for and what DEF were cultivated for. Let's go to read the words. So Hoyred Avmana Paskin, that Oirustin, this is a species of rose. Shari means it's not imbued with Kedusha Shvi'is. There are no restrictions. Okay, you can do what you want with it. Oidurudustoin, also Shari. Kitratoin Shari. Mirsintoin Shari. Darminoin Shari. Aber, however, Idroi Miroin, the Yoimiroin, they are Asur, because Rav Mana held that the latter two roses were cultivated for human consumption, right, for the Persian foods, and therefore they are imbued with Kedusha Shvi'is. So the word Asr doesn't mean Asr. It would mean, like what we're learning, that if something is cultivated for human food, you cannot use that for perfume. If something is cultivated for human food, then for sure it's imbued with Kedusha Shvi'is, and all of the rules of Shvi'is applies to it. In other words, you are restricted with its harvesting. You are restricted with its selling. You are restricted with the item itself. You may not take it outside the Holy Land, etc. Says the Gemara, Tzipore, the Yidden that lived in Tzipore, they asked Ravimi, Mahu lahotein bohen chitin. So guys, listen to how things work. In the Mishnah, we learned, when the Mishnah pointed out that even ma'acholim that are miyuchad l'maychel behema, are imbued with Kedusha Shvi'is, the Mishnah gave two examples, Hachoichem v'hadardorim, thorns and thistles. True, if they're very hard, even animals will not eat it. But we said that if they are soft, whatever that means, behemoths would eat it, it has Kedusha Shvi'is. Now, people would take those thorns and thistles, and they would either wet them, or as they were wet by nature, with towel would do, and they would place them over the wheat in order to soften the wheat. People would use thorns in the process of the wheat. It would benefit the wheat, which is for human consumption, but that process would render the thorns inedible for animals. So now that we said, la'achla v'lo lahefsed, that's what we're learning over here. Just like the rose petals, you may not soak in oil. You're using it for perfume. Perfume is also has chashivus, but if it's designated l'maychal adam, you can't degrade, you can't be mafsided relative to a better usage. Can I take the thorns and the thistles and use them in this process of keeping them together with wheat in order to somehow better the wheat? Why not? Because now the thorns and the thistles themselves will become inedible for animals. Amarloin, so we responded that afilu ale kursaya shiri, that even the leaves of this kursaya plant, which is even more edible to animals than thorns and thistles, nevertheless, we are allowed to use them to moisten wheat, because since anything that's even secondary in human food preparation is more chashuv than direct animal food. So you're not being mafsid, that you're upgrading it. So for sure, thorns and thistles, avada, are allowed to be used in the preparation of human food, even though the thorns and the thistles now won't even be edible to animals. You're not being mafsided. You're using it l'maychal adam, even though it's only an indirect use. I don't know exactly how they did it. They would put the thorns and the thistles with the wheat, and the moisture of this would go into that. It would somehow benefit the wheat in its process. Now, the main thing is like this. Taf nun daled. Amar Rabbi Yoshia, I want you to know that this psak is le'oivada usmoich alave. This is a very important ruling. That this psak, look inside the top marafulda. Lahaloch lemaisa amar lo. Usmoich alo lemaisa. This is very important, because when you have conversations in the Beis Medrash, even though Amoraim are opining, right? Omar Loin, Rav Imi responded. A response that Rav Imi would have given in a shir like this would not be allowed to be used halacha l'maisa, because there's a special siyata d'shmaya, because there's a special yira shamayim that a Rav has when he's being asked an actual question. And if he's not responding to an actual question, if he's having, because we're learning that's the whole daf today, we're learning about this topic, and you make a statement, then that would not be allowed to be used halacha l'maisa. Umikana, remember when Ablev Shapiro Shlita came over here and it was speaking about various statements that the Rebbe made over the years in Fabrengens about certain halachic topics that the Rebbe himself many times after Shabbos would give out to the chevra that were putting down the sikha on writing, that what he spoke about is not halacha l'maisa. He was speaking about the Rebbe spoke, I think more than once, that even though the Alter Rebbe says that halal b'tzibur, halal with the chiv is only a minig, right? And therefore normally we don't make brachas for a minig. So there's a whole question, why do we make a bracha on halal? I'm talking about Rosh Chodesh, where we say half a halal, not when we say the whole halal. So we pass, Alter Rebbe paskins, that when you daven b'tzibur and a chanami, only the shliach tzibur makes it for everyone. And in a Fabrengen, the Rebbe spoke about that, it's the inyan to make brachas, and everyone should make it on their own. And some people in our world held that the Rebbe was saying halacha l'maisa. So he's one of the Chabad Rabbanim that say absolutely not. He says the Rebbe said, and he came over here and he gave many examples when what the Rebbe says in the Fabrengen is Toiras emes complete in the Fabrengen. It could be it's emes on Olam Atzilus. You have to know where you're talking to. That's the way it always was. So the Gemara is making a point that Rav Imi, what he said, this din of using items that are Michael Behema for preparation of Michael Adam and ruining it was not said in the Beis HaMedrash. And if it would have been that way, you can't rely on it. Halacha l'maisa. No, that was said for a psak din. So this halacha l'maisa.